Once upon a time, there were two young women, Emily and Sophie, inseparable friends since their early childhood. Their bond was so strong that they considered each other almost like sisters. Together, they shared all their secrets, their dreams, and had even sworn an eternal friendship. But what neither of them knew was that their fate had been linked long before they met. Paul, Emily's boyfriend, had known Sophie well before meeting her, back when they both attended the same kindergarten. Sophie and Paul had become very close, sharing moments of innocence and happiness. However, their paths suddenly diverged when Sophie's parents decided to transfer her to another school. Paul was devastated by the loss of his childhood friend and secretly harbored a deep love for her, although he never saw her again after the age of 10. Years passed and Paul, still haunted by that loss, tried to move on by pursuing his studies at university. It was there that he met Emily, a lively and charming young woman. They began dating, and although Paul enjoyed Emily's company, a part of him could never forget Sophie. Fate played a cruel trick when Paul encountered Sophie at an event organized by their mutual friends. The shock of seeing her again after so many years reignited feelings he thought were buried. Despite his commitment to Emily, Paul couldn't help but fall in love with Sophie again, recognizing in her the lost love of his childhood. Emily, who was madly in love with Paul, discovered one day with horror that he had feelings for Sophie. Her world collapsed in an instant. Devastated by this betrayal, she felt a deep pain and uncontrollable rage. Rather than confronting Paul, Emily turned to Sophie, her dearest friend. She accused her of betraying her, of stealing the love of her life. Sophie, surprised and helpless, tried to defend herself, claiming she never meant to hurt Emily. But blinded by her pain, Emily refused to listen. Consumed by growing hatred, Emily decided to get revenge. She began spreading malicious rumors about Sophie, seeking to tarnish her reputation and isolate her from their circle of friends. Emily's lies spread quickly, plunging Sophie into a deep depression. The dreams of eternal friendship turned into a nightmare. Paul, torn between his feelings for Sophie and his loyalty to Emily, found himself caught in a struggle. He realized that his choices had caused immense suffering to both women he loved. Consumed by guilt, he tried to repair the damage, but it might have already been too late to save what had been destroyed. Sophie, overwhelmed by the pain of betrayal and the weight of the rumors surrounding her, made a radical decision to find some inner peace. She abandoned her studies and decided to leave the world she knew to enter a convent. The silence and serenity of monastic life seemed like the only escape from the emotional turmoil she was going through. She hoped to find a new purpose, far from the conflicts of the past. At the convent, Sophie immersed herself in prayer and meditation, seeking solace for her troubled soul. Every day, she tried to leave behind the memories of her broken friendship with Emily and her growing love for Paul. Yet, despite all her efforts, a part of her heart remained attached to what she had lost. Meanwhile, Paul felt more and more lost. The guilt gnawed at him, and he realized that his feelings for Sophie went far beyond mere childhood nostalgia. He loved her deeply, and her departure had left a vast emptiness in his heart. He knew he could never be truly happy without her, but he didn't know how to repair the damage he had caused. Day after day, Paul tried to contact Sophie, but she was now unreachable. The convent, with its high walls and strict rules, protected Sophie from the outside world. Every letter he wrote went unanswered, and every attempt to see her failed. He came to the painful realization that he might have lost the most precious person in his heart forever. Life at the convent brought Sophie a certain peace, but her heart couldn't forget Paul. She often wondered if she had made the right choice in withdrawing from the world. Far from everything, she began to reflect on the meaning of her existence and what the future held for her. Despite her quest for spirituality, a part of her still yearned for the love and life she had left behind. On his side, Paul decided he couldn't remain inactive. Although he respected Sophie's decision to join the convent, he felt that he at least had to try to find her, to speak to her, to explain his feelings. One day, he set out, hoping to make contact with her, even if it meant waiting hours outside the convent, hoping to catch a glimpse of her face or hear her voice one last time. Weeks passed, and Paul finally arrived in front of the convent's imposing gates. His heart racing, he asked to see Sophie. The sisters, compassionate but firm, explained to him that Sophie had chosen to cut herself off from the outside world for a while, to fully dedicate herself to her new life. Disappointed but resolute, Paul asked to leave a letter for her, hoping she would read it one day. In this letter, he poured out his heart, confessing his mistakes, his feelings, and his deep regret for having lost her. He asked for her forgiveness, assuring her that he would always love her, whatever she decided. He left the letter in the hands of the sisters and walked away, his heart heavy but a little lighter for having expressed what he felt. Sophie received the letter a few days later. She hesitated for a long time before opening it, aware that what she would read could disrupt the fragile balance she had started to build. But in the end, she decided to open it. Paul's words deeply moved her, awakening feelings she had tried to suppress. For the first time in a long while, she wondered whether her future truly lay in the convent, or if there was still something for her to experience outside these walls. Paul's letter marked a turning point for Sophie. She began to question her place in the world and whether the peace she sought could be found elsewhere, perhaps even with Paul. But this decision was not to be taken lightly, and Sophie knew that she needed to find peace within herself first before considering a different future. 2 years had passed since Sophie left her former life to seek refuge in the silence of the convent. On her side, Emily, consumed by the hatred she held for Sophie, had severed all ties with her. Despite the passing of time, this resentment still enveloped her, pushing her to avoid any memory of their lost friendship. Paul, for his part, had stayed by Emily's side, not out of love, but out of necessity. He had tried to convince himself that staying with her was the right thing to do, especially after everything that had happened. Yet, his heart still belonged to Sophie, and he felt increasingly lonely, even while being with Emily. Their relationship had become a silent prison, where neither of them found true fulfillment. Life continued without excitement for Paul. Each day, he thought of Sophie, wondering if she had found the peace she was seeking in the convent. He regretted not having protected their bond, not having had the courage to choose his love for her over the security with Emily. The feelings he had for Sophie had only intensified over time, and the distance only amplified this longing. Emily, aware that Paul was no longer the same, felt the love fading between them. She couldn't help but wonder if Paul still thought of Sophie, and this thought poisoned her. She refused to admit that she may have lost him the day she let her jealousy consume her. One day, as Emily tried to rekindle some semblance of a connection with Paul, she realized that he had never truly forgiven her for her actions towards Sophie. This realization filled her with both anger and sadness. She understood then that she had trapped herself in a spiral of resentment that had ultimately destroyed what she had most wanted to preserve. Meanwhile, Sophie, after receiving Paul's letter, was tormented by a deep dilemma. The monastic life had brought her a certain serenity, but Paul's words had awakened in her a desire to live, to reconnect with the outside world, and perhaps to rediscover love. She began to question her choice to remain in the convent. Weeks passed, and Sophie, torn between her spiritual commitment and her feelings for Paul, decided to speak with the abbess of the convent. She confided in her distress, her doubts, and the letter that had disrupted her peace. The abbess, after listening to her kindly, advised her to take the necessary time to make a well-informed decision, without rushing. Sophie then began to consider leaving the convent to explore the possibility of reuniting with Paul and perhaps even building a new life. But this choice was not without risks. She knew that the decision to leave the convent was irreversible and that she would have to face not only the ghosts of her past, but also the complexity of the feelings that still bound her to Paul. Paul, still consumed by regret and uncertainty, continued to live with Emily, but he knew this situation couldn't last forever. One day, he finally made the decision to leave Emily, confessing that he could no longer live in deceit. This breakup, though painful, brought him a sense of liberation. Freed from this relationship, Paul resolved to wait for a response from Sophie. He didn't know if she would ever leave the convent, but he was ready to do anything to find her and show her that his love for her had never faded. One Sunday morning, while Paul was attending Mass at the Cathedral of Martin, an unexpected event occurred. As he was deep in prayer, he noticed a familiar figure among the congregation. A nun, dressed in her monastic attire, was seated at a distant spot, her head bowed in prayer. What particularly caught Paul's attention was the striking resemblance of this nun to Sophie. Though the veil and the habit obscured her face, Paul couldn't ignore the strong sense of familiarity that overwhelmed him. Anxiety and hope mixed in his mind. Paul wondered if this nun could be Sophie, but he knew that the religious attire made it difficult to confirm. After the Mass, he tried to discreetly approach the nun, but he was interrupted by the departing crowd, and the woman quickly disappeared among the other worshippers. Determined to know if this nun was Sophie, Paul decided to return to the cathedral every Sunday in the hope of crossing paths with this mysterious figure again. Weeks passed, and each visit was marked by anxious anticipation, with the persistent hope of finding the person who had captured his heart. Meanwhile, Sophie was immersed in her thoughts and prayers. The decision to leave the convent remained suspended, and she was seeking signs of guidance in her spiritual life. The shadow of Paul, evoked in the letter and in her memories, continued to haunt her thoughts, though she tried to focus on her spiritual journey. One Sunday, after several weeks of waiting, Paul found the nun at Mass. This time, he succeeded in following her to the church's exit. Gathering his courage, he approached her and spoke to her with respect and apprehension. "Excuse me, sister, but could you tell me where you dedicated yourself? I am a friend of Sophie, and I believe you look very much like her." The nun looked up, and a moment of silence settled before she responded. With a calm and emotional voice, she said, "I am not Sophie, but I understand why you mistook me for her. Sophie is a very dear friend of mine. She is currently in a convent near the city. Perhaps you could find her there." Paul felt his heart race at this revelation. He thanked the nun and immediately headed towards the convent she mentioned, hoping to finally find Sophie and have a chance to mend the past. Arriving at the convent, Paul met the Mother Superior, whom he had encountered before. He expressed his sincere desire to speak with Sophie. The Mother Superior, though initially reserved, agreed to let him meet Sophie, seeing the determination and honesty in his eyes. When Sophie learned of Paul's visit, she was overwhelmed. Their meeting was filled with contradictory emotions. They found themselves face to face in a peaceful garden of the convent, where Paul, with deep sincerity, expressed his regrets and his enduring feelings. "Sophie, I am sorry for all the harm I may have caused you. I've thought long and hard, and I now know that I still love you. I've come to tell you that I am willing to do anything to make amends, if you'll allow me." Sophie, though touched by his words, was still torn between her religious commitment and her feelings for Paul. She explained the dilemmas she faced and the path she had to follow to find inner peace. Their conversation was long and sincere, marked by moments of deep truth and hope. Sophie, though troubled, began to consider the possibility of reconnecting with Paul, while still staying true to her own convictions. Paul, convinced of the sincerity of his feelings, decided to give her time to reflect on her future. He committed to respecting her decisions, while hoping that their love might one day be reconciled. Thus, as Sophie continued her spiritual journey with a new perspective, Paul returned to the cathedral every Sunday, holding on to hope and preparing himself for whatever the future might bring, waiting to see if fate would offer them a second chance. After her meeting with Paul, Sophie felt overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. The weight of her past choices and the prospect of an uncertain future tormented her. To gain insight, she decided to speak with Father Robert, a wise and respected monk at the convent, known for his deep understanding of spiritual dilemmas. Sophie found Father Robert in the convent library, engrossed in his reading. She approached him, her face marked by concern and questioning. "Father Robert, may I speak with you privately?" she asked. Noticing the anxiety in Sophie's voice, Father Robert nodded and guided her to a quiet sitting room. Once seated, Sophie explained the details of her meeting with Paul and the inner dilemma she was feeling. She spoke of her lingering feelings for Paul, the conflict between her love and her religious commitment, and the fear of leaving the convent. Father Robert listened attentively, his gaze filled with compassion. When she finished, he spoke with quiet wisdom. "Sophie, you have made the decision to dedicate yourself to God and serve others, which is a noble and courageous path. But it is important to remember that serving God is not limited to wearing religious attire. It is also a matter of heart and action." He paused before continuing. "You are a strong woman, and strength is not solely measured by the ability to stay in the convent. Sometimes, true strength lies in the courage to reevaluate one's path and make choices that authentically reflect our faith and values." Sophie, listening carefully, felt her doubts begin to dissipate slightly. Father Robert continued, "If you are considering leaving the convent, it would not be a failure or a betrayal of your commitments, but rather a sincere reevaluation of what truly allows you to serve others. You must also consider that life outside the convent would not necessarily take you away from God. On the contrary, it could allow you to live your faith in a different but equally meaningful way." Father Robert's words deeply touched Sophie. The idea of leaving the convent, though still frightening, began to seem less intimidating in light of the prospect of a new path where she could find balance between her beliefs and her personal desires. Sophie stood up, thanking Father Robert for his valuable advice. She decided to take the necessary time to reflect on this crucial decision. She continued her prayers and reflections in the convent, while exploring the possibility of reevaluating her life path. Her heart was now at peace, knowing she could consider a future where she could stay true to her convictions while exploring new ways to serve others. Her determination grew as she began to envision a future with Paul, while remaining faithful to her spiritual path. As Sophie started to consider a possible future with Paul, events took a darker turn outside the convent. Emily, now influenced by the wealth and connections of her new partner, Jacques, a corrupt businessman, decided to take revenge on Sophie. Emily's obsession was fueled by deep jealousy, exacerbated by the fact that Paul had visited the convent in search of Sophie. Using her resources and connections, Emily launched a smear campaign against Sophie. She hired people to spread malicious rumors at social events and published degrading articles in the local newspapers. The accusations were severe. She claimed that Sophie, under her religious habit, had seduced several men and had even stolen her boyfriend, Paul. These accusations were like a thunderclap for the convent. Sophie, who had been striving to live her faith with sincerity, was suddenly faced with a wave of gossip and contempt. Members of the parish, influenced by the articles and rumors, began to avoid her. Sophie found herself isolated, distraught, and almost overwhelmed by this public shame. She felt betrayed and devastated by the cruelty of the situation, but she chose to stay true to her convictions. Months passed, and the pain of the slander continued to affect her. However, Sophie found comfort and strength in her prayers and meditation. She persisted in her spiritual commitment, despite the hardships. Father Robert, aware of the trials Sophie was facing, offered her support and encouragement. He regularly reminded her that her dignity did not depend on others' opinions, but on her integrity and relationship with God. "Sophie, it is crucial to remember that the truth always emerges. The malicious actions of others do not define who you really are. The light you carry within you is stronger than the darkness of lies and rumors. Keep living according to your principles and faith." These words resonated like a sweet melody in Sophie's heart, providing her with support in the darkest moments. She continued on her path with renewed courage, convinced that the challenges she faced were part of a greater plan. One day, as Sophie continued her spiritual journey with perseverance, a series of revelations began to unfold. Jacques, under pressure from his own business dealings and confrontations with the law, was forced to reveal Emily's involvement in the malicious rumors. The scandal erupted, and the truth was unveiled, clearly showing the manipulations and jealousy behind the smear campaign. Emily, once her actions were exposed, lost her influence, and her reputation was tarnished. The community, seeing the truth for what it was, began to reconcile with Sophie. Although the pain of the injustice she had endured was deep, Sophie found the strength to forgive, realizing that true freedom lies in letting go and forgiveness. Emily and Jacques, now exposed for their malicious actions, were tried in court. The overwhelming evidence against them, including their orchestrated smear campaign against Sophie and Jacques' financial fraud, led to their conviction. The court declared them guilty of fraud and defamation, and they were both sentenced to 10 years in prison. Their downfall was swift and final. Their wealth and power, once the source of their influence, could no longer protect them. Meanwhile, Sophie, though marked by the ordeal she had gone through, found peace in her heart. The truth, finally revealed, had restored her honor. The community, realizing the lies they had believed, returned to Sophie, seeking reconciliation. Sophie, faithful to her principles, welcomed these repentances with grace, convinced that forgiveness was the key to healing. One day, as Sophie was immersed in her prayers, Paul arrived at the convent. It had been a long time since he had visited, but he had never stopped thinking about Sophie. Their meeting this time was different. Paul, having observed from afar the resilience and dignity Sophie had shown in the face of adversity, realized that his feelings for her were deeper than ever. He approached her with a mixture of admiration and respect. Sophie, upon seeing him, felt her heart beat faster, but this time, she was ready to listen to her heart while remaining true to her faith. Paul, with palpable emotion, took Sophie's hand and looked her straight in the eyes. "Sophie, I have always respected and admired you for the strength of your faith and the nobility of your soul. But today, I understand that my love for you is far more than simple admiration. I ask you to grant me the honor of spending my life by your side. Will you marry me?" Sophie, touched by Paul's sincerity, closed her eyes for a moment to pray and seek inner guidance. When she opened her eyes, she felt at peace. She knew that her love for Paul did not have to be in contradiction with her faith, but rather a different way to serve and share that faith. "Paul," she said softly, "I am ready to begin this new chapter with you. But I want our life together to be a testimony of our faith and our commitment to serving others. If you accept that, then yes, I want to be your wife." Their union, far from being the end of Sophie's spiritual journey, became a new adventure where she could live her faith in a new way, but just as authentically. Together, they embarked on a journey where their love and devotion to God strengthened each other, showing everyone that faith and love, far from being opposed, could unite to create a life full of meaning and compassion. The big day finally arrived. The St. Martin Cathedral, majestic and imbued with a sacred serenity, shone under the rays of the sun filtering through the stained glass windows. The stone walls, adorned with vibrant flowers, added a touch of life and freshness to the solemn atmosphere. Guests, arriving from all over the French high society, chatted animatedly, eager for the ceremony to begin. As the organ began to play a soft, moving melody, a respectful silence settled over the assembly. All eyes turned to the entrance of the cathedral. Sophie appeared, dazzling in a pure white wedding dress, adorned with fine lace and sparkling crystals. Her delicate veil, hand-embroidered, added an aura of mystery to her radiant beauty. She walked slowly, arm in arm with her father, who looked at her with evident pride. The smile lighting Sophie's face reflected the peace and happiness she felt in that moment, a happiness she never imagined experiencing after all the trials she had endured. Paul, standing at the altar, tried to conceal the tension he was feeling. His gaze, fixed on the entrance of the cathedral, betrayed a slight anxiety. Despite the apparent serenity, there was a certain nervousness in him, as if he was still seeking confirmation, a sign that everything would be okay. His heart raced as Sophie approached him. When Sophie finally reached the altar, she and Paul exchanged a look filled with infinite tenderness. The priest, smiling kindly, began the ceremony. The sacred words resonated through the cathedral, bringing with them a sense of solemnity and spiritual depth. But as the ceremony continued, a persistent thought crossed Paul's mind. His eyes, though fixed on Sophie, seemed to search for something in the crowd. He felt a strange sensation, a mix of impatience and fear. As the ceremony progressed, the guests were captivated by the palpable emotion emanating from Sophie and Paul. The priest continued to speak the sacred words sealing their union, and when he asked Paul if he took Sophie as his wife, Paul's voice, filled with conviction and love, echoed in the cathedral. "Yes, I do." A murmur of emotion spread through the assembly, and some guests discreetly wiped away a tear. Sophie, her eyes sparkling, then turned her gaze to Paul. She felt her heart beat in unison with his, a feeling of peace and happiness overwhelming her. "I, Sophie, take you, Paul, as my husband, to love and cherish you in health and in sickness, in wealth and in poverty, and to remain faithful to you until death do us part." The words were spoken with such sincerity that even the flowers seemed to bow in witness to the solemnity of the moment. The ceremony continued, and when they exchanged rings, the symbol of their eternal love, the cathedral filled with a respectful silence, followed by a burst of light streaming through the stained glass, like a divine blessing on their union. The priest, with a benevolent smile, declared, "You are now united by the sacred bonds of marriage. May God bless you." Paul then turned towards Sophie, and gently, they kissed, sealing their love before everyone. The guests erupted into applause, and the cathedral echoed with the sounds of shared joy. At the exit of the cathedral, the daylight embraced the newlyweds, surrounded by their loved ones. Their eyes met, filled with promises for the future. Sophie and Paul, hand in hand, headed toward the carriage waiting for them, ready to begin their life together. They knew this journey would not be without its challenges, but they were confident that, as long as they remained united by their love and faith, they could overcome anything. Their marriage quickly became a symbol of love and devotion for all those around them, inspiring generations to come. Their life together, marked by compassion, faith, and service to others, became a living testament to what true love and faith can accomplish. May this story continue to inspire those who seek peace and love, despite the storms of life.